Hi there. You know, Easter's coming up soon and I've had a life-changing realization. The resurrection of Christ is actually the first ever recorded instance of a remake. He gets captured and thrown into a cave guarded by baddies where his life is saved, then 3 days later he comes out reborn and in a big suit of armor. Okay, I'm thinking of Iron Man. Anyway, let's move on. Now, the idea of a remake, particularly in video games, is a good one. Take an established title everyone loves, iron out a few of the kinks, and optimize it to make use of new, more powerful hardware. In some cases, rebuild the game from the ground up. But the obvious question is how many of these games actually needed a remake, and at what point are we losing out on new stuff by focusing on the old stuff? What separates the good remakes from the bad ones, and why there's so many fucking ways of saying remake? Now, before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's get a good understanding of the vocabulary, or at least try our best to do so. The gaming industry keeps coming up with new ways to say remake, and it's making me insane. You've got remake, remaster, remastered, remustered, redux, re-elected, reborn. This one scares me because the ... implies the actual name is longer, and this one isn't a remake, but I thought I'd just throw it in. It feels like most of the innovation in the industry the past few years has just been adding a reword to the end of the title that sort of relates to the game. There isn't really a massive difference between all the ways of saying remake. It's not like you can expect a differing level of quality from a reload compared to a redux, so I think we can get away with just calling them all remakes. Though I would say there are probably a couple exceptions. A remaster is normally nothing more than a slight graphics update, and definitive editions are normally just re-releases, i.e. bringing the game to a new platform with a lot of DLC included to justify the return to full price. Anyway, let's move on. 2023 was widely regarded as one of the best years in gaming, and rightly so. Tears of the Kingdom is amazing, Baldur's Gate 3 is an example of the quality that games should try to achieve going forward, and Redfall was the game of the year in the sense that it was a game that came out in the year. But 2023 was also probably the most remakes and re-releases we've ever seen in a year. The third and fourth highest rated games of 2023, according to Metacritic, were the Metroid Prime Remaster and Resident Evil 4 Remake. 2024 has already seen Persona 3 Reload, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and more. So the question is, why is this happening? Why are there so many remakes? Well, first of all, the industry is getting old. Some of the most critically acclaimed and loved games ever made are approaching 20, 25 years. Like many others, I'm approaching the age where I'm starting to become interested in playing these games, but the problem is, I'm spoiled, and I'm used to the more powerful technology of the last 7 years or so, used to 1080p or 4K resolutions, 60 FPS as the minimum, super realistic faces and environments, to the point where I'm reluctant to play older games like Zelda Ocarina of Time, even though I've heard it's amazing. So, there's a desire for people to experience older games in a way that doesn't feel like uncovering an ancient heirloom. But it also works in both ways. People who grew up playing these games will have a great deal of nostalgia, and would probably also love to play a souped-up version releasing now, so they can relive that same feeling they had when playing the original. So it's clear that there is a want for these remakes. But we can be more pessimistic than this. Games cost an unbelievable amount of time and money to make. There is a huge amount of risk. Games could be in development for years, then release, sell 12 copies and be forgotten about in a month. Any way to reduce the risk will be very welcome to investors and publishers. Let's take Sony as an example. Spider-Man 2 cost $300 million to create, Horizon Forbidden West $220 million, God of War Ragnarok $200 million. Now what do you notice? Window Ledge, they all cost a lot of money. Yes, you're right, but also, they're all sequels. So much money is spent because it can afford to be spent, as they are follow-ons from established and popular titles. Sony knows that these games will at least make that money back. That's the same sentiment with remakes. Why would you risk putting money into a new IP, a new universe, when you can put the same amount into a remake or a sequel you know for certain will sell above a pretty high threshold? Taking that risk is what gives us games like goddamn Redfall. The last SIE game that wasn't a remake or a sequel was Returnal. That was 3 years ago, and despite being a good game, has sold like 500,000 copies, which isn't a lot compared to these. Personally, I think a game budget shouldn't be any more than like 50 million. I don't care if it makes the graphics look a little worse. And you may be thinking, yeah, there's a lot of money spent, but these games obviously are making that money back, so it's fine. But here's the thing, Sony just laid off 900 employees, many being part of their game studios. Despite going for the safe choices, something is evidently still going wrong. So either we're going to see more remakes and sequels, or the gaming industry is going to implode. The former isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when it's been 3 years since your last new IP, and you start remaking things that just don't need to be remade, Capcom have proved themselves to be one of the best when it comes to remakes, especially with regards to the Resident Evil games. In the past 5 years, they've released 3 Resident Evil remakes and 2 good Resident Evil remakes. What sets the RE2 remake apart though is that it's just a completely new experience, and just so you know, that's the 23rd time I've said remake in this video. The original came out 21 years prior in 1998 and is unrecognizable, apart from Leon, who looks good as ever. The game used static camera angles. You can't look around or anything, you're just constantly jumping from one camera to the next when you pass through invisible trigger points. It's so disorienting, and the main reason I had no interest of playing the original. Now, this wasn't really a design choice as much as it was a technological necessity. Having the backgrounds be pre-rendered from each camera angle means a massive reduction in processing power usage, as it's basically just a twink walking in front of a JPEG. This also allowed the characters to be pretty detailed for the time, as they were the only part of the image that needed to be rendered. But by 2019, this really didn't hold up, which is why the remake was so groundbreaking. You can actually move your neck, and you no longer have to play glorified security cam footage. This is another reason for remakes to be made. Graphics aren't the only thing that get outdated, gameplay does too. Developers have a far better understanding of what's fun and what is just annoying. The original Resident Evil 4 had this mechanic where if Ashley were to get injured, you'd have to use your own hard-earned healing items on her. This mechanic was removed in the remake and I don't think anyone misses it. But back to RE2, I think it's the perfect example of a remake that felt necessary. Persona 5 Royal is one of my favourite games I've played, and it was really my first exposure to the series apart from Joker and Smash. When it finished I was sad, but thankful that there were still 4 other entries in the series. I then found out that 1 and 2 basically don't exist, and 3 and 4 were both over a decade old. Still, I recently tried 4, but stopped pretty early on. The characters were awesome and the life sim parts were still great, though not as fleshed out as 5. But the gameplay really felt outdated. Not at all saying it was bad, I'll probably get back to it very soon and get used to it, but I'm just saying I felt the age. It also stopped me from wanting to play 3, but then they announced Reload and I was interested, and I've been playing it for the last month, and my god, it's peak. To be honest, a lot of the things I like about it aren't even all that different to the original, which means I didn't really have much to worry about. The story is engaging and the characters are just as amazing as the cast from 5. But again, the gameplay saw the biggest changes that are almost unanimously better. You can now dash while in the dungeons, which you couldn't do before, and the tiredness mechanic was removed entirely, which genuinely completely put me off from playing the original. Thanks to the remake, I experienced the story and characters I probably wouldn't have done if it didn't exist, and I'm very thankful for that. That's the best thing about games being remade. But I do have something to mention about the Atlus Persona games. Earlier I said 5 Royal was my first exposure to the series, but that was actually a lie. The original Persona 5 was the first. I played this in 2019 and loved it, but stopped halfway through because they released Royal, which was said to be better in pretty much every way. I was like, oh okay, I assume it's a DLC, or perhaps even a free upgrade. Nope, it's £50 again. The game had only been out for 2 years and it already had a remake. Yeah, I guess you could argue that it isn't a remake, but come on, it kinda is. It put me off from finishing the original because I thought I wouldn't get the definitive experience, but also spending another £50 wasn't something I could do at the time. It was only when the game came out for Steam that I got back into it, and I'll be honest, I'm kinda happy I didn't finish the original, but that doesn't mean I forgive you, Atlus. You're still taped to my dartboard. The changes were great, but could it have been a £20 DLC or at least like a discount for those who own the original? I feel like it could have, but this isn't the first time Atlus has done this. They did it with both 3 and 4. Full price releases just a few years after the originals. They can get away with it because they're great games, but it does feel a little bit deep. Now back to Reload, and while I think it's great, it still can't quite be classed as the definitive way to play the game. There are actually 5 different versions of Persona 3. 5! Persona 3, Persona 3 Fez, Persona 3 Portable, Persona 3 Portable re-release, and now Persona 3 Reload, and I really regret going on this tangent, don't worry, I'm nearly done. If you want the full Persona 3 experience, you're probably going to have to play at least 2 of these versions. Alright, let's break it down. The 2006 original has the base game, albeit the most basic version. Portable 2009 has a better version of the base game with gameplay improvements, but also the ability to play as a female protagonist, which changes lots of dialogue and allows for new social links. Fairly normal so far. But now we go on to Fez, which has the base game from Portable, but a new epilogue section to the story. However, it doesn't have the female protag. Now, the portable re-releases are essentially just this, though can be played on more platforms. Like 2009, it has FemC, but no epilogue. And finally, Reload has arguably the best version of the main story, with great graphics and gameplay, and the doggy is voiced by a human.
No.
But doesn't have FemC, and the epilogue is £30 extra and doesn't release until September. Why do I have to mix and match? I feel like the reason for a remake is to create a definitive version of the game, one where if someone says the name of the game, you think of the remake. I don't think that can be done here. Anyway, that went on way too long. Let's talk about something nice. When The Last of Us Part 2 released, it sparked some of the most hateful discourse ever, an embarrassing time for the gaming community as a whole. This goes on for years and is still going on. Enter the brave hero, Naughty Dog Studios. What do? They give an announcement which unites both sides to say, why are you remaking this? But can you blame anyone for thinking this? The game was only 3 years old. Does this mean we're getting a Hatsune Miku Logic Paint remake next year? I hope so. This is the problem, when games that really don't need to be remade are remade. The money and time could have gone to other new projects, but no, we're stuck in the past.
We're boring!
The time could have been spent on making the inevitable Part 3. I mean, they're probably going to announce the remake beforehand. And what's worse is that this is technically the game's second remaster. When the original came out, the PS5 hadn't released. It did so about 5 months later. And a bit after it did, the game was updated to make use of PS5 features such as haptic feedback and, more importantly, an increase from 30 to 60 FPS. And it was a great improvement over the PS4 version while technically still being the PS4 version. So literally, why does this exist? It has a new game mode, but that could be DLC. It supposedly has improved graphics, but I genuinely can't tell. Here's a side-by-side. One is the PS5 update remaster, and one is the actual remaster. Can you tell which is which? You can? Interesting. Very interesting. The truth is that they're both actually the PS4 version, captured on my PS4, which is a decade old and recently had water spilt on it. This is Placebo in a little box. It gets bonus points for allowing owners of the original to pay a £10 upgrade instead of £70, but still. Now look, if I give an opinion on the actual game, The Last of Us Part 2, I'll be beaten to death with hammers, so I'll just say this. The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered does not need to exist, and I think you'd struggle to convince anyone otherwise. On one hand, remakes are great in that they promote established titles to new audiences who probably wouldn't have experienced them in the first place. On the other, we're seeing such a crazy amount that we might be missing out on new stuff, and the insane cost of games points us towards seeing more in the future. There are great ones, and there are those that just feel completely unnecessary. Anyway, thanks for watching, and join me next year for the 4K remake of this video.